For. Basically, what I'm thinking is if anyone's ever heard of the radio show Open Line with Michael Rydelnik, basically it's a show where people call in, they ask questions, and he does his best to answer them. He is a highly educated biblical scholar. However, I am a pastor at a local church. I'm going to do my very best, and that's why I have some access to some commentaries. I've got the trusty Moody Bible commentary. Yes, it appears right now that we're having a little bit of trouble. There we go. Basically, okay, let me turn my volume down here. There we go. All right, so it came in a little bit late, but here we are. We're live. Nobody's watching right now. Well, actually, it says one is watching, but that's me. So, we're just hanging out. I've got my hot tamales, I've got some tea, and I love hot tamales. If anybody is bored and wants to ask a biblical question, that would be great. I've said this before, I'll say it again. We are, me, I'm basically doing my own little version of an Open Line with Michael Rydelnik. If you've never heard that show, check it out. I'm sure you can get it on iHeartRadio or something like that. Great show where a Bible scholar named Michael Rydelnik takes phone calls and answers questions about the Bible, God, and the spiritual life and all that stuff. Fantastic. I'm not him, not that smart, but we can hang out together and look into the Bible and look at some commentaries and try to answer questions. But nobody is on right now. So, apparently not that many people are quarantined being really bored. So, cool beans. I suppose I'll just sit here and drink my tea. Quarantine. I'm an introvert, so I don't really mind quarantine. I kind of wish I could quarantine myself all year long. But I get it. Some extroverts who are very different than me are not liking this at all. So, anyways. Waiting. There's a whole bunch of really cool stuff that I just installed at the church to improve our Wi-Fi connection. It's pretty neato. And it's keeping our connection good. And, yeah. There's about a 20-second delay to this video, so it's actually not, technically it's not live. So I can watch what I did on the computer. Oh, it's great. It is fantastic. I'm actually wondering what the sound is like. Let me do this. There's about... Alright. Sounds like it might be a little quiet. I have an itch on my head. So the first 20 minutes of this video might be me just sitting in this room under these lights, doing random things. Maybe what I can dive into is what I've been doing on my story, my Facebook story and Instagram stories, is I've been looking at situations in the Bible where things did not go good for certain individuals. Meaning, these people were following God, they were doing what God wanted them to do, but yet things did not work out. I think there's a prevailing thought amongst many religious believers, whether it's Christianity or not, but even amongst a lot of Christians, there's this thought that if I'm obeying God, I'm doing what He wants me to do, I won't really have to, everything will fall in line, and I won't really have to face big challenges or anything. And that's simply not true. That's actually not in the Bible. What we see in the Bible over and over again, all throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, is that God's people, whether they were doing the right thing or not, following God, loving God, encountered lots of trials. And a lot of times there isn't like an explanation of why even. I think many times we feel like either we won't encounter trial or we want an explanation from God. God, why in the world did this happen to me? Why did this happen to other people? And it's just that question, I think, has become, well, it's come to the forefront of people's minds with this pandemic. How could God allow this to happen? And I don't have the answer. But what I do know is that it doesn't contradict what the Bible says or teaches, or it doesn't contradict history as the Bible portrays it. God's people encountering difficult times. So I think the last two stories, I literally just started in Genesis. And I've just been going through literally just from passage to passage. And after the fall of man, in Genesis chapter 3 there, chapter 4, where we see God, or man, kind of turning away from God and going his own way, immediately there, I just started with the story of Abram, rather than Noah and the flood and all that stuff. But right away in Abram's story, his nephew Lot gets kidnapped. He has to go rescue him. That's the last thing I talked about. Genesis chapter 15 talks about the Lord's covenant promise to Abram. 16 is the birth of Ishmael. 17 is the naming of Abraham. Another thing to mention, though, is this, that Abraham was faithful to God, and yet for whatever reason, until they were much later on in years, Sarah was not able to have children. That's another thing, especially back in this culture, that was a very hard thing to deal with. In our day and age, yes, I'm sure many women who are not able to have kids, couples who are not able to have kids, are devastated by that. I'm not saying that they're not. I'm just saying that back in this day, it was a really big deal if you were barren and you couldn't have kids as compared to today. It's still a big deal, but it was back in this day, man, it was a tough deal. And I'm sure Abraham and Sarah questioned, why are we not able to have kids if we're following God? I highly doubt that was never a question in their minds. So that's another thing. But then we see God coming and promising that they will have a child. And then they have Isaac, obviously. Genesis 19, Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. Genesis 20, Abraham actually kind of loses his trust in God a little bit and deceives a king of the area, just like he deceived the Egyptians in saying that Sarah was his sister, not his wife, because he was afraid that they would kill him. Genesis 21, the birth of Isaac. 22 is the story of Abraham's faith being tested, where God says, hey, go and sacrifice your only son, right? And Abraham shows that he does have faith. I actually just heard somebody try to get in the doors. I'm going to go see what that is. All right. I'm back. Anyways. Where was I? Yes, Abraham's faith was tested. Oh, here's a really good one. Really tough thing that a lot of people have been through, the death of a loved one. Genesis chapter 23. when Sarah was 127 years old, she died at, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. It's called Hebron. It says now called Hebron, in the land of Canaan. There Abraham mourned and wept for her. So that brings up the unfortunate fact of life that the great statistic, 1 in 1 people will eventually die. So we see Abraham now, faithful to God for many, many years, having to face the death of his wife. Not an easy thing. It just says, there Abraham mourned and wept for her. Then leaving her body, he said to the Hittite elders, here I am, a stranger and a foreigner among you. Please sell me a piece of land so I can give my wife a proper burial. So, just another example of a faithful follower of God facing something difficult. And then we have Genesis 24, a wife for Isaac. Abraham sends one of his servants back to, I believe, the land in which he came. Yeah, he says, go instead to my homeland, to my relatives, and find a wife for my son Isaac. So he sends a servant to go find a wife. The servant comes back with Rebekah, wife for Isaac. Excellent times there. And then Abraham finally passes away. But he had married another wife, and he had some more kids after that. He lived to be 175, so he lived 50 years after Sarah passed away. That's crazy. Then Esau and Jacob are born. We see in Genesis chapter 26 that Isaac continues kind of that weird thing that Abraham did, where he would tell rulers that his wife was actually his sister. That's a whole theological thing we could talk about. Let's see here. We see the conflict between Jacob and Esau. Jacob ends up stealing Esau's birthright and his blessing. You know, a little sibling rivalry there. Jacob flees back to Padam Aram, which is where Rebekah was from. Oh, man. Oh, boy. Alrighty, let's see here. Jacob gets a couple wives, Leah and Rachel. But we see in Jacob's story also, actually, that as he was working for his uncle named Laban, Laban kind of was dealing underhandedly with him. I don't know how else to put it. He was kind of cheating him out of stuff, and then Jacob, being kind of the crafty one, was able to end up cheating Laban. It was like, what in the world? All these different things. He ends up fleeing Laban and all this stuff. This is just real life. That's what we see in the Bible. We see real life in a real fallen world where things happen that people don't necessarily want to happen. Makes a treaty with him. Jacob comes back. He's scared of Esau because he fled from Esau in the first place. I think probably the best story to really illustrate this point, and then I think I'm just going to sign off here because apparently nobody's available at this time and they have to figure out a different time to go live. But remember, we will be live. Me and Kelsey will be live tonight from 6:30 to 7:30 if you want to tune in. We're going to do another live youth time. So grab your favorite snack and join us tonight. But the story of Joseph, I think, is probably one of the best to illustrate this idea that bad things do in fact happen to good people. Bad things happen to people who are definitely following God and doing everything that He wants them to do, but somehow He's able to take those bad things and use them for good. So, we see this in Joseph's life. Joseph was a favorite son. In fact, he was such a favorite son that all the other brothers knew this, and they hated him for it because their dad was just all about Joseph. And if you haven't read the story, it starts in, let's see here. It starts in chapter 37 of Genesis. I would encourage you, go read it and learn all that you can learn and see how even Joseph, who was kind of this innocent teenager, God gave him all these visions. And he tells his brothers and his parents, and they're all just like, what in the world? Because it was kind of, the visions that he had were kind of like, I'm going to be the ruler, I'm going to be over you guys. And people are like, what in the world? Well, his brothers hated him, and they basically orchestrated him to be, they were going to kill him. And then they were like, well, let's not kill him, let's sell him into slavery. And he goes through, Genesis 37, 38, well, Genesis 38 is a different story. But then we get back into it in Genesis 39. Joseph's a slave. He gets framed. He gets put in prison. Genesis chapter 40, he interprets some dreams. Still sits in prison for 2 years, 41. 2 full years later, Joseph is finally kind of taken out of prison. He predicts some of Pharaoh's dreams, and he's made the ruler of Egypt. And then Joseph's brothers come, and my, how the tables had turned. And the dreams that God had given Joseph when he was just a kid started to formulate. But this is a long time after. Joseph had to wait a long time, and a lot of bad things happened to him in between when God had given him his dreams and when his dreams came to fruition. And then we read in chapter 42, 43, 44, those are kind of just stories about Joseph talking with his brothers and kind of messing around with them, really. And then finally in chapter 45, Joseph reveals his identity. And then, so I think there is I'm trying to figure out where this extremely important passage is. Let's see here. Finally, Jacob actually dies. And his brothers are like, okay, now that our father is dead, Joseph is finally going to get retribution on us. But listen to this. Let's find it here. He said, so they sent a message to Joseph. This is his brothers. Before your father died, he instructed us to stay with you. Please forgive your brothers for the great wrong they did to you, for their sin in treating you so cruelly. So we, the servants of God of your father, beg you to forgive our sin, because they're worried. When Joseph received this message, he broke down and wept. Then his brothers came and threw themselves down before Joseph. Look, we are your slaves, they said. But listen to this. This shows Joseph deep wisdom and understanding of God's plan and how he worked even through bad things. But Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? That is a really important theological point there. We leave retribution, we leave punishment, we leave judgment in God's hands. He says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children. So he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. That's Genesis chapter 50, verse 16 through 21. That passage right there is, I think, the attitude that anybody who's faced a really tough time and God has brought them through it and brought good out of it can say. What maybe the enemy or another person meant for evil, God has used for good. God meant it for good. God somehow in his infinite wisdom and knowledge and understanding of the world and how everything works has brought about good even out of things that by themselves are evil. So that's pretty much all I've got for you this morning because nobody's watching. If you watch this later, feel free to shoot me an email, a Facebook message, or an Instagram direct message, whatever you want to do. And let me know maybe there's a better time when more people are available to do this. And maybe just, this was such short notice. I'll be back again tomorrow to see and continue kind of this experiment. And if it is not a thing that's going to work or be beneficial for people, we'll figure out something else. So I will see you guys later. Let me turn the live stream off.